rioting, killings, so much that Meredith is under constant federal guard during his time at the university. With his graduation in 1963, the 2-year duel lapses, but Mississippi would remember. June 6, 1967, Meredith is coming home after time in Africa at New York's Columbia Law School. Home to Mississippi, on foot, walking alone and unarmed through some of the most remote and racially unsettled counties in the state. It's a 220-mile stretch from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. He is making his solidarity journey to promote black voter registration and to combat the fears blacks feel about living and traveling freely in Mississippi. My objective was to expose all pervasive fear that existed. You had 1 million blacks in Mississippi, 12,000 registered to vote. Now this was 2 years after Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Bill, but still no one had registered to vote. Even though Johnson had signed a bill saying that blacks have the right to vote, and all they had to do was go in and sign the book, most blacks still didn't sign the book. Now it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because they were afraid of the consequences. They didn't know what would happen. Before, when they tried to push the point, someone would come out to the courthouse lawn and shoot them. They didn't know for sure whether it would be the same consequences. The question was, had we changed or hadn't we changed? Memphis, only 12 miles from Mississippi and once a giant kingpin of the Cotton Empire, is the starting point. People are attracted to his mission. A black soldier, a Memphis businessman, a minister from New York spontaneously take up the march with him, all on the basis of an inspiring chance meeting. Meredith is a compelling figure, helmeted, carrying an ebony and ivory walking stick, a gift from an African tribal chieftain. He walks past the hopeful and the hate-filled. Occasional groups of blacks dot the roadside with quiet support and prayers, even as cars full of angry whites dog him along Highway 51, wildly swerving in his direction. It is a continual intimidation. Threats of blind anger pour out. I hope to hell you die before you get there. He walks on. It is a hot, sultry afternoon. The heat shimmers above the steamy asphalt highway. Photographer Jack Thornell is covering the march for the Associated Press. We were leapfrogging with our cars, just staying a little ahead of him. From the bushes, a man's voice quietly speaks. James, James, I only want James Meredith. Meredith turns toward the voice in the bushes and gunshot ricochets along the road. The other marchers sprawl out on the highway. What alerted us was the first shot. I think it was a warning shot to scare everyone else away. I hopped out of the car and started taking pictures. Now, 2 successive blasts shatter the stillness. Meredith falls, writhing in pain on the asphalt. From the brush skirting Highway 51, a man is apprehended, whom neighbors describe as, quote, a very nice man, as nice a neighbor as you could ask for. Meredith is rushed to Memphis Hospital. Emergency surgery will carve 60 shotgun pellets from his head, neck, back, and legs. For his deadly assault on James Meredith, Aubrey James Norville will spend 18 months in jail. Dr. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, Dick Gregory, and other black leaders continue the march. By the time they get to Jackson, they are 18,000 strong. The march will give rise to a new phrase, Black Power. And if you look at the picture now, you can see the attacker visible in the ditch. Yes, Brooke?
So you say like they do marches like for this certain cause or whatever. But how do they know? Like, how do people know that they're doing that? Like, how do they say, hey, I'm gonna do this, they like get people to do it? But like, do people actually like go register, go after? They say, oh, like that guy's walking, I better go do this. Like,
yeah, probably not. I think it's the point of the civil rights movement. It's a good point. That doesn't mean it's working. Johnson's Civil Rights Voting Rights Act didn't really work. It gave them the right, but they were still being intimidated to tell you to do something about it, and that's part of the problem. Yes.
Wait, so this said he went into emergency surgery. Did he not die?
No, he did not die.
wait, it's deadly.
60
Could have.
pellets, 60 pellets sounds pretty bad, but if
Okay,
that
so that's why I
guy
don't
has
need
like
one.
one to do like a lot more.
Yeah, shh, listen up. Mason's got a great point here.
60 pellets sounds pretty bad, but if that guy wanted to do a lot more damage, he actually used one shot that would have had like maybe 10 at most, probably more like 4.
Yeah, and
that would've
also,
torn him up a lot worse than the 60, because those are just punctured
yeah,
stocks.
and also it's the length of the barrel that matters. The shorter the barrel, the worse damage that gets done to you. So, anyway, that's just something to think about. Anyway, it was not good, I can tell you that, and it did not help. Now, we're not done with this. This incident that involved James Meredith led to the formation of a militant civil rights organization known as the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers were a very, very radical, violent civil rights group that were founded in Oakland, California. So this incident involving James Meredith would lead to the formation of the militant Black Panthers organization. They were a radical, violent civil rights group that were founded in Oakland, California, and they were led by two men, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They would be the leaders of this new radical civil rights group known as the Black Panthers. Newton once said in a comment, "Political power comes through the barrel of a gun." That was his comment. Political power comes through the barrel of a gun. I actually have a deal on Bobby Seale. This is kind of interesting. There's Bobby Seale up there. That is a return address when he sent something to someone on a manila envelope, and that was in the top left-hand corner, and that was his return address that he wrote. And that's Bobby Seale right up there, one of the two members that organized the Black Panthers. Now, the Black Panthers were the most publicized group in the United States that advocated the Black Power issue. They were the most publicized group in the United States that advocated the Black Power issue. Okay, this is really going to be on your test for sure. What we're going to do now, it's not another subtopic, but we're going to make a four-part comparison of Martin Luther King's philosophy of civil rights to that of Black Power. Okay? Four-part comparison. We'll start with number one. We've already talked about this to a point, but number one, Martin Luther King Jr. believed in a nonviolent approach, right? Nonviolent approach to civil rights. We all know that, right? The comparison is, number one, that the Black Power movement believed in armed self-defense. So whereas Martin Luther King believed in a nonviolence approach to civil rights, the Black Power movement believed in armed self-defense. So there's the first comparison between the two. Martin Luther King believed in a nonviolent approach to civil rights. The Black Power movement believed in armed self-defense. Number two, I think we all know this, Martin Luther King Jr. believed in the integration of blacks and whites, putting them together, the integration of blacks and whites. How many of his civil rights marchers were white? Most, actually. So, he believed in the integration of blacks and whites, whereas the Black Power movement believed in total separation of blacks and whites. While Martin Luther King believed in the integration of blacks and whites, the Black Power movement believed in the total separation of blacks and whites. That's the second comparison. The third comparison is that Martin Luther King Jr. believed in working with the system. Working with the system. Despite your disagreements, we're going to work with the system. Try to get the system to change. He believed in working with the system. Despite the fact you don't agree, you're going to try to work together and get it fixed up. Whereas the Black Power movement believed in preparing for revolution. So as Dr. Martin Luther King believed in working with the system, Black Power believed in preparing for revolution. And number four, the fourth comparison, I think we all know that Martin Luther King believed in including white people in the civil rights movement, right? He believed in including them. Black Power believed in excluding whites in the civil rights movement. So the fourth comparison is Martin Luther King believed in including whites in the civil rights movement, whereas Black Power believed in excluding whites, from the civil rights movement. Totally polar opposite. You see what we're facing here, okay? All right, that ends the things that happened during that particular time. But a good question, and I've got to give you a little background, I guess, is what was Martin Luther King's philosophy of the Vietnam War? We haven't got to it yet because we're kind of going Great Society, Civil Rights. This all happened at the same time, and we have a Vietnam War going on, okay? And everybody's against the Vietnam War for the most part by this time. By 1967, it was getting tough, okay? People started to change. So, what was Martin Luther King's philosophy? Well, on April 4th of 1967, he was speaking at a church in New York City. On April 4th of 1967, he was speaking at a church in New York City. Now, had President Johnson, let me preface this by saying, had President Johnson been supportive of civil rights at this point? Really he had. We shall overcome. He really was a supporter of King, okay, at that time. Well, on April 4th of 1967, when speaking at a church in New York City, Dr. King officially spoke about the Vietnam War for the first time, what his feelings were on the Vietnam War. And when he gave that speech on April 4th, 1967 at that church in New York City, when he spoke officially for the first time about Vietnam, he spoke against it, which meant he was speaking also against who? Lyndon Johnson. So on April 4th, 1967, at a church in New York City, Dr. King officially spoke out against the Vietnam War, which meant that he would be speaking out against President Johnson. And his philosophy was a little bit different. He believed that all this money we were spending, and I'll tell you what, by the end of 1967, anybody want to guess what the Vietnam War was costing the United States daily? Daily. $1 million a day it was costing. And Martin Luther King thought we should take that $1 million a day and do what with it? Help with the civil rights movement, help fight poverty. You know what I mean? So he stated in his speech that this money that we are spending on the Vietnam War ought to be used at home to fight poverty. Because if we fight poverty, we might be able to get people to get along. You know, love thy neighbor, right? Love thy neighbor. $1 million a day it was costing. Today, $7.3 million today. A day for that war by the end of 1967. Well, the problem with this is Dr. King spoke his mind, but these remarks he made is going to drive a big wedge between himself and probably his biggest ally concerning the civil rights movement in Washington, D.C., and that would be President Johnson. That was really a huge mistake. And it really hurt his civil rights movement because he lost support of his present followers by making those comments that were loyal to who? President Johnson. And if you lose followers, what do you lose? What kind of support? Money. Okay? So this Vietnam War comment cost the civil rights movement, at least King's views of it, because he lost support of some of his present followers, and he lost financial support from those same followers. Yes?
So just like to put that in perspective, those missiles that we launched in Syria will take $60 million to replace all this.
Isn't that crazy? It's just nuts. I'll tell you that. Remind me another story about this. Now, do you remember Walter Reuther, who was the white fellow that spoke at the Civil Rights March on Washington? Do you think he was a supporter financially? Probably was. Now, I'm not saying he did this, but it would be people like him after his comments that may quit giving money to the civil rights movement. So it really hurt King. A lot of Americans thought King should stick to civil rights and not get himself involved in foreign policy. That was kind of the idea. Well, during the summer of 1967, King became very depressed about what was happening in the civil rights movement. During the summer of 1967, he became very depressed, and he stated publicly, "I must confess that the dream that I had that day, in many points, has turned into a nightmare." So he stated in the summer of 1967, after becoming very depressed, he said, "I must confess that that dream I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare." All right, we'll move on and finish with this today. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King In late March of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had traveled to the city of Memphis, Tennessee. In late March of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to the city of Memphis, Tennessee. The reason that he went to Memphis, Tennessee is he went there to support a strike by black sanitation workers. So, in late March 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and the purpose of his visit to Memphis was to support a strike by black sanitation workers. Anything, my man? Okay, well, good.
We'll catch up with you
Oh,
later.
no, just sit, yeah. Now, these workers had been on strike since February, and what they were demanding were better pay and better working conditions. And since they were black sanitation workers, which is a kind name for garbage truck fellows, right? King thought he should go there and support that strike because he believed truly that they were getting paid poorly and their working conditions were bad. But they had been on strike since February, so February came about most of March, and Martin Luther King travels in late March to support that black sanitation strike. Well, the evening of April 3rd, he walks side by side with these black workers. The evening of April 3rd, he marches side by side in protest with these black sanitation workers. And that night, he arrives at the Masonic Temple in Memphis and gave maybe one of his most powerful but prolific speeches. That night of April 3rd, he arrives at the Masonic Temple in Memphis, and he gives one of the most powerful and prolific speeches he's ever given. Now, I'm going to read this to you, and I want you to write down this 4-sentence ending. And I want you to tell me what you think he's thinking about in this speech. This is a part of the speech he gives. He goes, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. What's he thinking about in that speech? He's not going to live much longer. He sees the civil rights movement getting him. Well, that would be the last speech that Dr. Martin Luther King would ever make. The next afternoon, on April 4th of 1968, Martin Luther King was staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Yep, he was staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. And we have a motel kind of like this here. It's kind of over by Haskell Furniture. There's a motel that goes down, I think, Russell, where they have a balcony around the top where you can step out of your room on the top floor. There's a balcony. That's how the Lorraine looked. And that afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped outside on the balcony right outside of room 306 where he was staying to get some fresh air. The afternoon of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King stepped outside on the balcony of his room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis to get some fresh air. And he stood alone on the balcony, and he noticed some friends below, so he leaned over the balcony and was talking. You see those rails? He leaned over and was talking to those friends that were below him. Well, suddenly at 5:30 p.m., a single shot rang out in Memphis, Tennessee. Suddenly at 5:30 p.m., a single shot rang out. And Dr. King was hit in the neck, and the bullet tore away the complete right side of his jaw. So he was shot in the neck. This would be up in this area here. Took off the whole right side of his jaw. He was immediately rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital in Memphis, and he was there within 15 minutes of the shooting. was immediately rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital and was there within 15 minutes of the shooting. And doctors tried desperately to save his life. So he was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital within 15 minutes of the shooting, where doctors desperately tried to save his life. At 7:05 p.m., and this is all Central Standard Time, at 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at the age of 39. At 7:05 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at the age of 39. What do you think his death set off across this country? Monster riots. There were riots and violence in 40 cities across the United States. 40 cities. The most notable cities where rioting occurred were Chicago and Washington, D.C. Chicago and Washington, D.C. And in Memphis, they brought in 4,000 National Guard troops to back up police, and they enforced a dusk to dawn curfew in Memphis to try to curb this violence. So they brought in National Guard troops, 4,000 into Memphis, and initiated what they called a dusk to dawn curfew. Nobody out of their homes to try to curb this violence.